Hi, everybody. This is Adam Elenbaas from Nightlight Astrology, and I am recording a daily video blog on December 15th. And in today's video, we're going to be talking about a couple of topics. We're going to be talking about Old Saturn. We're going to be talking about what it means that Saturn is culminating and that Saturn is sort of at the end of Saturn's life cycle right now. We're going to talk about Saturn being born again, Saturn Cazimi. There's a lot of interesting transitions that are coming up right now for Saturn, so I want to talk about them, and we'll spend a little time with each of them as we make a short little recording here. So some of you might be familiar with the fact that Saturn is currently at the 29th degree of Sagittarius. Saturn will be moving into Capricorn right around the winter solstice. I think it's sometime on December 19th. So it's like right on the cusp. We're just days away from Saturn changing signs. Now, the other thing that some people don't know is that whenever the sun conjoins with Saturn, the sun moves through the zodiac much quicker than Saturn does. So whenever the sun conjoins with Saturn, it starts a new Saturn cycle, which is conceptualized as sort of the rebirth of Saturn, or it can participate in a symbolism of something that is being reborn in our lives. So it's actually pretty unique that the sun is just about 6 degrees off from Saturn right now, and is going to actually conjoin Saturn and cross over Saturn on December 22nd. So literally at the solstice time, we have over a span of about 3 days, we have Saturn changing signs, and then we have the sun conjoining Saturn, starting a new Sun-Saturn cycle, another synodic cycle with Saturn, which means that Saturn is being reborn. So those two phenomenon plus the winter solstice are all happening right around the same time. And then in the middle of that, right around the, it'll be later on the 21st and into the 22nd, Saturn will also be Cazimi with the sun, meaning Saturn will be right at the center of the sun. And also when Saturn changes signs and Saturn is in its own dignity, its status also changes, because in Sagittarius it relies on its ruler Jupiter. When it's in Capricorn, it's only relying on itself. It's in its own home temple, so it has a bit more ability or power to facilitate its own symbolism. Saturn becomes a bit more, I like to say that when Saturn is in its own sign, you can get a little bit more of the virtuous Saturn to call. So all of these things are happening right at once, and we want to try to make a little bit of sense of them. First of all, let's talk about the fact that we have an old Saturn. Why do we say we have an old Saturn? Because as the synodic cycle between the Sun and Saturn is restarted at the conjunction, when the sun is approaching that conjunction behind Saturn in zodiacal order. So right now the sun is at 22? Let me just go back. 23 Sagittarius. Saturn is at 29 Sagittarius. So the sun is approaching Saturn from behind it in zodiacal order. When that occurs, for the last 15 degrees, that the sun, when the sun enters to within about 15 degrees of Saturn, we say that Saturn is combust, meaning you lose the light of Saturn. You can't see Saturn in the sky anymore. For the most part, it can vary a little bit, but symbolically, ancient astrologers used about a 15-degree orb to say when any planet comes within about 15 degrees of the sun, it's swallowed up by the light of the sun. And so because the lights of the planets reflect their own powers as symbols, when they lose that light under the power of the sun, it's thought to sort of weaken their symbolism. And they usually, when they're under the beams, it's also either the very beginning of their cycle or the very end of their cycle. So they're either young and the planet is either sort of young and emerging to get its own footing, or it's old, falling under the beams and about to sort of die and be reborn. Well, this is a Saturn that's about to be reborn. We have the sun, again, coming up on Saturn. Gradually, over a long period of time, Saturn has been weakening. If you want to understand a very, very simple and sort of beautiful symbol for this, how this would play out in like the mundane news, we have Saturn in Jupiter's sign. Jupiter, for example, is the sign of is a planet that relates to politicians and senators and people who hold public office and things like that. Well, we have news that in the headlines that John McCain, old senator, is frail and weak and perhaps getting closer to passing, right? And we see that it's not a coincidence that as Saturn is culminating the last degrees of Jupiter's sign at the very end of its life cycle in Sagittarius, and it's falling under the beams of the sun, it's dying in the synodic cycle, we see the image of an old frail senator passing away. Or, for example, we see in some ways perhaps the first cracks in the establishment of Republican power, for example, right now in office after the Alabama election. You see that kind of maybe the end of an order, the end of an era, something Saturnine that usually will express itself as a held structure, tradition, authority, or something like that, is maybe on its last leg. It's starting to fall. It's starting to crumble. The old order is starting to come down. Now, we look in the sky and we see that same symbolism repeated by the fact that Saturn is in a trine with Uranus right now. So, there's been changes to established structures over the past couple of years in very big ways, especially related to Jupiterian things like politics. Those aren't just, good changes. There are all kinds of changes. But as Saturn approaches the very end of its lifespan and it's falling under the beams of the sun, you see an old Saturn. So when you're applying an old Saturn to your life, you can look in your birth chart, look at the house in which, if you use whole sign houses, it's very easy. But if you look at the house in which Saturn is culminating and about to change signs, perhaps into whatever house, you can think of whatever house the Capricorn rules in your chart if you use a quadrant-based house system. And you just look and you say, okay, Saturn is, there's a changing of the guard happening. And this is an old Saturn. So old things, might be about to fall off and depart. Their time may be up. There's an expiration date sort of symbol in the air right now. So that's one way of thinking about what's going on. The other thing to think about in general is just that when Saturn is born again, what comes out of the rebirth phase of Saturn is usually a sense of wanting to start at the foundation of something, rebuilding from the ground up. So digging down deep into the core and sort of looking and saying, okay, I'm going to start afresh. And sometimes, it's the new year, it's winter solstice. So it fits in really nicely right now with this sense of some kind of overhaul that might need to be done in our lives, some kind of psychological, spiritual, or professional or relational period of time where, even if it's just an internal shift of some kind, we're really ready to let some kind of really maybe old structure fall away. Maybe something, especially with Saturn and Sagittarius, that we've been really passionate about, a season of dogma, a season of intensity, a season of being too strict, or a season of not, of our hearts not being open enough because of a certain kind of intensity that we carry around something that we believe in really powerfully. So there may be time for something like that to fall away and to rebuild maybe from the ground up. And it can be simple things too, like you're finishing a project, or you're finishing just a certain time, a time period or a season in life is coming to a close. So you think about different Saturnine endings, and then this also the sense of the oldness. Now, when Saturn swings across the sort of winter solstice moment and it then moves into its own sign, much more comfortable Saturn. And you also have the sun then eclipsing Saturn. And as it does so, Saturn becomes cazimi. What cazimi means is basically that whenever the sun is conjoined with a planet to the exact degree, and within that, it's thought to actually be within 15 minutes. If they're conjoined within actually 15 minutes within a degree, which is also related to the symbolism of the 15 degrees of combustion. Within that 15 minutes of an exact conjunction, it's as though Saturn becomes an emissary on behalf of the king, the sun. Well, the sun is sort of a royal symbol, a symbol of authority and power and light and life-giving power, sort of executive power or mastery. And when Saturn comes into that exact cazimi, it's as though it is temporarily given the power of the king, like an emissary would be. You would treat an emissary in a foreign country like an ambassador of a president. You would roll out the red carpet for that person because they are sort of an incarnation of the president come to visit. They have the power, the word, the blessing, the negotiating power of the president. So we're also going to see not only just a rebirth moment, but a real time where Saturn becomes empowered. Now, for people, I mean, Saturn is a taskmaster, and Saturn is in some ways, as time is related to karma, Saturn is the lord of karma. All things that we reap in time, we sow in time. And so when Saturn changes signs and is reborn and is given that kind of executive power, it's an amazing opportunity to start at the foundations, to get down to the ground level of something, to really root out things that we don't need anymore, or to have resolve and stick-to-itiveness to begin something new. However, if there's something that isn't naturally going toward reform, or that's resisting a kind of change or breakdown, this moment can be, this transitional moment can be about breakdown. It can be about, the death and transition, where we're kind of having to face the music a little bit, and from there start a whole new chapter, start from the ground up. And that's not always easy, but it in some ways it sort of depends on the kind of karma. I think generally speaking, if we're going and kind of consciously participating in the unfolding of our karma in the world, and we're doing our best, we're sort of playing the game as ethically as we can, and if something comes up, we recognize it, we don't try to avoid it, we take responsibility for it, all Saturnine things, then I think this is a pivotal moment where we can be looking at a transition that's actually really beautiful, even if there is some pain in growing up and taking of responsibility for past actions or something like that. It's when we're denying, ignoring, trying to wield all the power and control. We don't recognize that ultimately that power and control is an illusion, that it comes and goes in time as seasons of time pass and as actions bear out their consequences. Eventually we all have to face the music of our actions in life, and they become the gateway to spiritual understanding if we allow them to be. If we don't, then it's sort of like we just keep driving ourselves into the pattern until we do. So, and Saturn just has Saturn has all the patience in the world. You know what I mean? Like Saturn's like, if you want to just keep, driving yourself into the ground, I've got all of time because I am time. So it's, it's like, Saturn has a great sense of humor too, but if you want Saturn to become more timeless, if you want Saturn to become more of a participant in those changes in consciousness, then you have to be able to kind of pony up and see where you've been misguided and take the responsibility. And and when you do at this moment, because Saturn's cazimi, because Saturn's being born again, because it's the winter solstice, this is like an opportunity for like a mega New Year's resolution. That's how I'm looking at it. So at any rate, so that should cover everything that I wanted to talk about today. Saturn culminating can also be, remember, at the very last degrees of any sign, those degrees are generally, the bound rulers of those degrees are malefics. So it's Saturn and Mars at the end of a sign. So there's always a kind of, intense, destructive, culminating presence at the end. It's in Mars's bound right now, Saturn is. So there might be a kind of, a confrontational moment over the next 4 or 5 days. It's also, we're coming up on new moon, right? So it's not only all of this, but I didn't even say that, it's a new moon as well. So just remember that the next 4 or 5 days, and this doesn't happen for everybody. Sometimes people are like, nothing happened for me. And it's like, yeah, because everybody's karma is completely different, and astrology is not a perfect map for everyone at all times, especially not mundane astrology. You really do need to look at the birth chart, and if you can, study your own birth chart, learn the language of astrology and apply it more personally, that's when you really get the most mileage out of it. But at any rate, hopefully this is helpful for everybody. My goal was to get this done in 15 minutes today. I'm trying to I have Saturn coming to oppose my own Mercury. So I'm learning how to be, more concise with some of my offerings. So this is my own foundation, 15 minutes. All right, you guys have a beautiful Friday. Bye, everyone.